Chapter 1 of Bill Biddon, Trapper. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynn Thompson. Bill Biddon, Trapper by Edward Sylvester Ellis. Chapter 1. Out late at night. "How is it, Nat? Any light yet?" "Not the least sign of one, and it's my opinion it will be a long time before we see another." "What! You haven't given up all hopes of reaching the camp?" "I hope not, as I don't relish the idea of camping out to night." "Nor I either, but I am thinking it will come to that sooner or later." "Well, there are several hours yet in which we must plod onward," I added, trudging wearily behind my companion. Before going further, I may as well introduce my friend and myself. My companion answered to the name of Nathan Todd, and was a native of Maine. He was a tall, lank individual, with long, attenuated limbs, and an awkward appearance generally. He was very meagre and muscular, and when roused to a heat of passion, as quick and powerful as the panther. His gait was an ungainly, straddling one, and he was seemingly capable of anything but speed. But on one or two occasions since leaving the States, he had shown a fleetness of foot which was truly wonderful. He was a good, open-hearted fellow, and one who, when driven to the wall, would be a dangerous enemy. Once or twice, however, he had shown the white feather, and his natural timidity would often evince itself. As a consequence, Nat was not, perhaps, the safest companion in the hour of danger. But, for all that, there was no one in our party whose presence I would have preferred upon the night in which I introduce him to notice. There was no imminent peril threatening us, and Nat was a capital companion, who could while away the hours, if he chose, with his inexhaustible store of anecdote and humour. I knew he entertained a warm affection for me, and would brave almost any danger rather than be suspected of his only deficiency. A single intimation would decide his course in a moment. Nat wore a singular dress, half savage and half civilized. His pants and shoes were such as are fashionable in the enlightened world, but a capacious hunting shirt encased his body, secured around the waist by a heavy band, and much the same as are worn by the hunters and natives of the far west at the present day. The most striking part of his dress, however, was the hat. This he had brought with him from Maine, and it really seemed indestructible. It was a grey colour, and having lost its band a long time before, had acquired the shape of a cone. When it rested on his head, the edge reached the shoulders behind, and the eyebrows in front, and the pointed peak was far above the crown. Nathan Todd's face was full of shrewdness and good humour. He had a large curved nose, broad mouth, and a fine blue eye. The chin was retreating, but this drawback was modified partly by a long tuft of yellow hair, the only signs of beard upon his face, except a shadowy moustache. The hair was long and sandy, and harmonized well with the rest of his countenance. There was ever a contraction of the eyebrows, a sort of unspoken question, so often seen in persons from "down east," which indicated a prying, curious disposition. As for myself, my name is William Relmond, and I hail from one of the Middle States. Shortly after the announcement of the discovery of gold in California, I was seized with the lunacy that was carrying its thousands to the Pacific coast. I was well situated in life at home, but that was not considered. I must go and fish up a fabulous fortune also. I had one brother and several sisters, but our parents had been dead for some years, and we were residing with an uncle, the guardian of each until maturity. A favourable opportunity offering, I had made some preparation for the legal profession, but I was never inclined to coke, and had no intention of pursuing the practice of the law in after life. At the age of 20, then, without a settled purpose in life, I determined to make a journey to the El Dorado of the New World. I was not influenced solely by the love of gain in taking this step, but the love of adventure urged me irresistibly on. I had heard wonderful stories of the boundless prairies, of the wandering hordes of Indians, their millions of buffaloes and horses, and the vast billowy ocean of verdure and sunshine, and the far West seemed the paradise of the world to me. I was provided with an ample outfit at home, and departed among the tears of my good uncle and affectionate sisters. I proceeded by the usual route to Independence, Missouri, where I made inquiries of the trains which were constantly leaving the point for Oregon and California. In my wanderings I stumbled upon Nat Todd, my present companion. He had just arrived from his distant home, where he had left a widowed mother and a disconsolate sweetheart. But he said he was going to return, in just 2 years from the day he left, with a rousing heap of money, and intended to buy Squire Hunt's farm, take Alminy down there, and live the rest of his life. His frankness and humor impressed me favorably, and, after a short conversation, we grasped hands and swore to remain by each other till our adventures were terminated by death or a happy denouement. We engaged places in a train which left the next day. This company numbered nigh 200 persons, and was composed of all kinds of characters except females. There were French voyageurs, Irishmen, and an agent of one of the Western fur companies, and the majority of the rest were those just from the plough or the workshop. They had secured the services of an experienced guide, and were well equipped for the perilous journey before them. The overland route at this time was so alive with passing emigrants, that few depredations were committed by the Indians. The savages sometimes hung around companies, but as there were almost always other whites in sight, they rarely ventured upon any greater crime than pilfering. Nothing worthy of note occurred upon the journey for a length of time. We experienced the usual mishaps and trials of emigrants, but nothing more startling. We sometimes lost a part of our baggage and provisions in crossing the rivers, and were greatly discomfited by the terrific storms which often rage in these regions. Then, again, we travelled mile after mile, and hour after hour, upon the dry, monotonous, glistening, rolling prairie, so wearied and tired of the scene that we hardly exchanged a syllable for hours at a stretch. At last the plains of Kansas were reached. On the day in which I introduced my friend and myself to notice, we had descried a solitary antelope at a great distance upon the prairie, and set out to bring it down. We left our horses behind, hoping to reach the animal by stratagem. I approached it near enough to wound it, when it made off with the speed of the wind. Expecting to see it give out each moment, we followed it mile after mile, until gathering darkness warned us that the night was at hand, when we halted in alarm, and were compelled to allow the antelope to escape, while we endeavored to retrace our steps. The caravan was nowhere in sight, and we doubted not that it had disappeared hours before. We left the train about noon, and had been warned that they would not halt or wait for us, and should we lose them, they would take no pains to hunt us up. But we heeded not this, as we expected to keep them constantly in view, and have the antelope cooked for our supper. But I have shown how widely we were mistaken. We were compelled to see the night shut down around us, without bringing us any hope of spending it with our friends, and at a late hour we were still plodding aimlessly over the prairie. "No light yet, Nat?" I asked for the 20th time. "Well, I should think you had asked that question about often enough, to be suited with my answer." "I expect to ask it a dozen times more." "Then I'll just answer at once for all, so I won't be troubled again with talking. No, there's the answer." "I don't know but what you are right, Nat. We must have come a long distance, utterly unconscious of it, in our eagerness to get that plaguey antelope, and it is useless to hope to reach camp again before morning." "That's my opinion exactly. That camp, I opine, is a good dozen miles off yet." "Then we may have a chance of reaching it still before morning, as this bright moon favors us." The moon, full and clear, had arisen an hour before, and its light illumined the prairie for a good distance around. Far away, on every hand, we could discern the blue outline of the horizon, while the prairie seemed to roll up against it like the dark boundaries of a mighty ocean. Everything was as silent and motionless as though we were treading a region of death. Mile after mile we trudged on, beguiling the time by conversation. The ground was dry and hard, and the vegetation scarce and stunted. The day had been quite warm, and there was a delicious coolness about the evening air that made it pleasant to walk an hour or so; but as more than double that time had expired since we commenced, it had long been exceedingly wearisome to us. "I wonder whether those fellows will go a foot out of the way to pick us up," muttered Nat, half to himself. "I don't believe they will. They told us they wouldn't, and they value their time too highly to waste it for a couple who are of no account to them, especially since we can fall in with other trains. I reckon they're of some account to us, being that they have got our horses and considerable of our traveling apparatus." "That is too true, Nat. In fact, since we have been walking here, I have persuaded myself that those fellows would, just as likely as not, turn something out of the way to get rid of us. Somehow or other, I've just felt the same for a week. Then, if we value our property, we mustn't let them slip." "No, I'll be shot if we must!" exclaimed Nat, half angrily, striking at once into a more rapid walk. "If they run off with my mare, I'll and again he strode faster over the prairie. Long, long we journeyed in silence. Nat's apprehensions had been aroused, and he was willing to walk the whole night to come up with those in whose honesty he had so little faith. Now and then he would mutter incoherently to himself and shoot ahead, keeping me almost on a run to maintain my place beside him. Suddenly he halted, and turned upon me with an expression I shall never forget. I could see his eyes expanded to twice their usual size, and his whole face aglow beneath his monstrous hat, as he asked in a cold whisper: "Wonder if there's Injuns about to-night?" I laughed outright. "Why, Nat, you aren't afraid, are you?" "Who said I was afraid? I just asked a question." "What possessed you to ask such a question?" "Don't know. Just came into my mind. Do you s'pose there are any Injuns roving around the country to-night?" "I'm sure I cannot tell, but I think it extremely probable. Are you fearful that there are some upon our trail?" "There might be." "No. I was thinking if we should come across any of them, they might be able to tell us whether any of them chaps think we're lost, and have run off with my mare. Should we meet a lot of those savages, no doubt they would tell us something else beside that." "I expect so," and he wheeled around and strode ahead again. It was now getting near midnight, and I was completely worn out. It was out of the question to reach the camp that night, and we might as well submit to our fate at once, so I spoke rather decidedly. "I'm tired of this." Nat turned and looked at me a second, and then answered: "So am I. We've to camp out to-night, and there's no use in waiting till morning afore we do it. Ain't it lucky you brought your blanket with you? It would go hard to do without that to-night." "I brought it with me by merest chance, not thinking I should need it. It was indeed fortunate. And now let us prepare to use it." There was not much choice on the hard but warm earth. My blanket was ample and sufficient for us both. After some search, a small depression was selected, and in this I spread my heavy blanket. When we stretched ourselves upon it, pulled the ends over us, being sure to enclose our rifles in its folds, and resigned ourselves to sleep, in that lone hour I forgot not that there was one arm upon which I could rely, and one only who could watch over me until morning, and to that protection I appealed. Ere the sun was fairly above the horizon, we were up and upon our way. Knowing the company would be in motion for several hours, we hoped to reach them before they breakfasted, and have a laugh over our night's adventure. Nat led the way, and took long, rapid strides over the ground, seemingly oblivious of the existence of anyone else. I kept beside him, now and then venturing a remark, but receiving no answer or intimation that I was heard. Suddenly my friend came to a dead halt, dropped the butt of his rifle to the earth with a ringing clamp, and wheeled upon me with one of those indescribable looks. I had seen these before, so that I knew something unusual was agitating him. "What's the trouble now?" "It's no use. We'll never see that company agin." "What makes you think thus?" "I know so. I had a dream last night that my mare was gone for ever and ever, and I know she is. Don't you remember that fur agent told us they'd changed the direction they's travelling some time yesterday? They hadn't done it when we left them, and they done it as soon as we got out of sight, I'll warrant." I now remembered hearing our guide remark, as also did the fur agent with us, that the trail we were following made an abrupt bend some miles ahead. We were travelling northeast at that time, and the contemplated change was nearly due southwest. This fact had entirely escaped our minds, until it now occurred to Nat, and we had, consequently, been proceeding in a wrong direction. By referring to the sun, we found we had gone far too much to the east in order to intercept the train, which was now in all probability many leagues to the southwest. This was a discovery which was overwhelming. We had then been journeying in a direction which had brought us not a foot nearer the company than if we had remained motionless, and it was certain that the party was irrevocably lost. "This is a pleasant discovery, Nat." "Very." "I see no hope for your mare. She is probably a good day's journey distant, and we do not know what direction to take to reach her." "That's it," replied Nat, ill-humouredly. "If I'd knowed sure what way to tramp to find her, I wouldn't stop till I'd laid my hands on her for a certainty. But this trudging along, and just as like as not going away from her all the time, isn't the thing. I see no course left then but to proceed south, in the hope of falling in with some emigrant train, or in striking the Oregon Trail north, and getting into California ahead of them." "The Oregon Trail will have to be our destination then. If these fellows find they've got the start of us, they won't give us a chance to come up again, and we might as well try to catch the whirlwind as to follow them. No, we must try the ready for them when they come." "How far is the trail off?" "It can't be more than a day's journey. The trail follows the Platte through Nebraska, and I'm pretty sure we can reach it by nightfall, if we proceed pretty steadily and rapidly." The day was clear and pleasant, and the sky devoid of the least signs of threatening storm. There were 2 or 3 white clouds straggling off in the western horizon, but the sky was of a deep clear blue. We were now proceeding in a northward direction, intending to strike the Platte at the nearest point. South, east, and west, the small waving hills of the prairie stretched, unrelieved by the slightest object, except in the west the far-off outline of some mountain peak was just visible, resembling a slight pointed cloud against the blue sky. This appeared at noon, and we were again like wanderers upon the illimitable sea. A short time after, Nat's keen vision detected a number of black, moving specks far to the westward. "An emigrant train, perhaps," I suggested. "They're Pawnee Injins, as sure as the world, and we'd better give them a wide berth." "Pawnee Indians? How do you know that? You never have been in this section before." "That's true. But you don't s'pose I started out here without first larnin' somethin' about the country and folks, do you? If you do, you're mighty mistaken. Just let me know in what part of the country we are, and I'll let you know what sights you will see. That is, if we are going to see any at all. But let's keep to the east. I don't want to keep them Pawnees in sight." "The Pawnee Indians are reported friendly to the whites." "Exactly. But have they been reported honest? If they should come upon us and take a fancy to our rifles, what is there to prevent them from taking them? And," added Nat, with a shrewd shake of his head, "I've not faith enough in their good intentions to want 'em in sight at this particular time." There was a great deal of reason in his remarks, and it was not unwillingly that I turned my face more to the northeast, and soon saw them disappear from view. Some time toward the middle of the afternoon we descried a solitary buffalo ahead. He had apparently left his friends and wandered about as though entirely lost. After considerable difficulty we approached nigh enough to bring him down. He was quite poor, and his flesh was strong and Oregon Trail, and get into California first and be tough. But we were glad enough to get it, such as it was. He was thrown on his face, with his knees bent under him, a keen knife run through the spine with just sufficient force to penetrate the skin, which was then pulled down each side. This done, we cut the choice portions out. Nat reserved the buffalo skin for his blanket, and the rest was thrown away. We made a hearty meal, and about the middle of the afternoon again set forward, hoping to accomplish quite a distance ere nightfall. Just at dark we reached a stream of considerable size, which I afterward learned was the Republican Fork of Nebraska. The point at which we struck it was about where it leaves the territory of Kansas and enters Nebraska. Although no considerable stream, we concluded not to cross it before morning, and we made arrangements for passing the night upon its banks. There was considerable timber at different points, and a goodly quantity of driftwood lay scattered along the banks. As the river was quite low, we gathered several armfuls, and had a fire soon started. We had brought some meat of the slain buffalo with us, but concluded not to cook supper, as our appetites were satiated. Seated round our fire, half hidden in a depression in the river bottom, with the dark, glistening stream flowing silently by, and smoking our pipes, we naturally fell into an easy conversation. "We can't be far from the trail, can we?" asked Nat. "Farther than I suspected," I answered. "The Republican Fork, which I am convinced is the stream out there, is over 50 miles from the Platte, which, with several other streams, must be crossed before the trail is reached." "Fudge! I don't believe I can head off them fellows after all, and my old mare and overcoat will go to thunder." "They will go somewhere where you will never see them again." "I know I'm bound to lose 'em, and I shan't think any more about them." "That's the best plan, Nat. They are no great loss." "I should like to know whether that greaser of a fur agent took them, though," interrupted my friend, earnestly. After this he fell into a fit of musing, and we remained silent for some time. When the fire had burnt low, I arose and replenished it. Nat looked anxiously at the roaring blaze, carrying ash and cinders high in the air, and reflecting far out upon the dark river, and he remarked, "Wonder if some Injuns won't see that?" "I guess not. We are so low down the bank that I think it can be visible from no considerable distance upon the prairie, and the bend in the river fortunately saves us from view up or down the stream. The only point from which it would attract attention is directly across from us." "And it looks suspicious enough there," repeated Nat in a whisper, removing his pipe and gazing across the river. It did indeed look gloomy, forbidding, and threatening. Our fire was nearly on a level with the water, which rolled darkly and noisily at our feet, and when its crackling blaze arose higher than usual, the low face of the opposite shore was struck by the light. At such times I could not help reflecting what unfavorable chances were afforded any foe who might be lurking opposite. I involuntarily shrunk from the fire, and felt relieved when the shore blended with the darkness. It began to grow quite late. The fire had smoldered low, when Nat, removing his cap, turned upon me with, "What do you think of our journey to California?" I was at a loss to comprehend his meaning, and looked at him for an explanation. "I mean to ask whether you feel in such a hurry to get to mines as you did when we were in Independence?" Now, to confess the truth, the experience of the last week or two, and especially of the last 2 days, had done much toward dampening the ardor which I once thought could never leave me; and I believe, had I possessed moral courage enough, I should have seized the first opportunity to return to the comforts of a home where I possessed enough to satisfy any sensible person's ambition. Still I hesitated to commit myself. "I cannot say that I am. But what induced you to—" "I'm sick of this business," interrupted Nat, lengthening his legs in a spiteful jerk, and looking disgustedly into the fire. "What has come over you?" I asked, half amused at his manner. "Well, there's that mare. But you promised not to think of her." "How can I help it, I should like to know? She's gone for sure. And there's that overcoat that cost me $4.50 in Lubeck, and Alminy made a big pocket in it on purpose for me to fill full of gold chunks, and I should like to know how I'm going to do it when a greaser has got it." "I am afraid that that would not be the only difficulty you would be likely to experience, Nat, in getting it filled." "And my jackknife was in that coat pocket, I declare!" exclaimed he, suddenly starting up and pinching alternately one pocket and then another. "Yes, sir, that's gone too. That's worse than all the rest," he added despairingly, falling upon his elbow and gazing abstractedly into the fire. "That's a trifling loss, surely, as you have your hunting knife. I've a good notion to get up and go back now," he added, not heeding my remark. "I'm sick of this business. It's bad enough to lose the mare, but when the knife is gone I can't stand it." I knew this was but a momentary despondency with my friend, and for the sake of whiling away the time before sleep, I was inclined to humour it. "But what will you do for that gold that you was going to buy Deacon Hunt's farm with for your Alminy?" "Let her go without it," he answered gruffly, without removing his gaze from the fire. "She can get along without it. I believe she only coaxed me to go off to Californy to get me out of the way, so that mean Bill Hawkins might take my place. If he does come any such game, he'll catch it when I get back." I laughed deeply, but silently, as I witnessed his appearance at these remarks. It was so earnest and feeling that it was impossible to resist its ludicrousness. "Nat," said I, after a moment's thought, in which my mind had taken an altogether different channel, "I am free to own that I have little faith in our success in California. I left home in a flush of excitement, without considering the consequences of such a rash step, and they are now beginning to present themselves. I propose that we seek our fortune elsewhere. The fact that gold exists in California is now known all over the world, and we know there is not the remotest corner of her territory which is not swarming with hundreds who leave no means untried to amass their fortunes. I have no desire to wrangle and grope with them, and would much rather seek wealth elsewhere. But where else? If gold exists in one spot on the Pacific coast, it is right to suppose it exists in many others, and what is to prevent our finding it? Have you thought of any place?" "It seems to me that in Oregon, among the spurs of the Rocky Mountains, there must be fabulous quantities of the precious metal." "But why hasn't it been found?" "Oregon is thinly settled, and no suspicion has led them to search for it." "Well, let us dream upon it." A few more faggots were forthwith heaped upon the fire, and then we lay down for the night's rest. My companion had lain but a minute, when he suddenly sprang to his feet and exclaimed, "Hurrah for Oregon!" "Be careful," I admonished. "Your indiscretion may be fatal. That wall of darkness across the river looks gloomy and threatening enough to me." "It does. Hello, I'm shot! No, I ain't neither." That instant the report of a rifle burst from the other bank, and the bullet whizzed within an inch of my companion's face. "Heavens, we are attacked!" I ejaculated, starting back from the fire. "I believe so," replied Nat, cowering behind me. We listened silently and fearfully, but heard no more. The fire smouldered to embers, the river grew darker, and the night, moonless and cold, settled upon us. But no sleep visited my eyelids that night. Till the grey dawn of morning I listened, but heard no more. End of chapter 1.
Chapter 2 of Bill Biddon, Trapper. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Bill Biddon, Trapper, by Edward Sylvester Ellis. Chapter 2, A New Friend. As the light of morning overspread the stream and prairie, I felt an unspeakable sense of relief. Not a moment of sleep had visited me that night, although Nat's extreme fear toward midnight gave way to his drowsiness, and he slept long and heavily. "Come, wake up, Nat," said I, shaking him as soon as I saw that day was at hand. "What's the matter?" said he, rubbing his eyes and gaping confusedly about him. "Day is at hand, and we must be on our way to Oregon." He hastily rose, and we commenced our simple preparations. I ran up the river bank and swept the prairie to the south of us to satisfy myself that no wandering Indians were in sight. The whole plain was visible, and with a feeling akin to joy I reported the fact to Nat. He, however, was not satisfied with my survey, as he had more than once before detected objects that had escaped my vision, and he ascended a high roll in the bank some distance up, and took a long, careful, scrutinizing sweep of the whole horizon. Feeling satisfied that he would be no more rewarded for his pains than I was, I started the fire, and commenced cooking some of our buffalo. I had been engaged in this for a minute or so when I heard Nat call, in a hoarse, anxious half-whisper, "Come here, quick!" I hurried to his side, and eagerly asked him the cause of agitation. "Why, just look yonder! If that ain't enough to agitate one, then I don't know what is." He pointed across the river, out upon the prairie, and following the direction of his finger, I saw not more than a mile or two away a single horseman proceeding leisurely from us. "Who can that be?" I asked, half to myself, still watching the receding figure. "Why, he's the one that sent that bullet across the water after us, and I'm thinking it's lucky for him he's going another way. If I should get my hands on him, he would remember the time." And Nat extended his arms energetically and shook his head spitefully by way of emphasizing his remark. I continued gazing after the unknown person. At first I supposed it was an Indian, but at that distance and with his back toward us it was almost impossible to judge accurately. A moment's thought convinced me that it was a white man. I could make out the hunting cap of the trapper, and was soon satisfied he belonged to that class. His horse was walking leisurely along, and he seemed totally unaware of the proximity of strangers. But who could it be? Was it he who had fired the well-nigh fatal shot? And what meant his actions thus willfully leaving us? These and similar questions I asked myself, without taking my eyes from him or heeding the numerous questions and remarks my companion was uttering. But of course I could give no satisfactory solution, and when his figure had grown to be but a dim speck in the distance, I turned to Nat. "We may see him again, but if I don't know him, I know one thing. I'm wonderfully hungry just now." We partook of a hearty breakfast, my appetite for which was considerably weakened by the occurrence just narrated. Without much difficulty we forded the Republican Fork, being compelled only to swim a few strokes in the channel, and reach the opposite side with dry powder and food. Here we made a careful search of the shore, and ascertained enough to settle beyond a doubt the identity of the horseman with the would-be assassin of the night before. His footprints could be seen in the place where he had slept upon the ground, together with the scraps of meat. By examining the tracks of his horse, we discovered that both hind feet were shod. This decided our question of his being a white man, and although it cleared up one doubt, left us in a greater one. He could not have avoided the knowledge that we were of the same blood, and what demoniacal wish could lead him to seek the life of two harmless wanderers? Be he who he might, it was with no very Christian feelings toward him that we took the trail of his horse and pursued it. Our course after the first 5 miles swerved considerably to the northwest. From the actions of the stranger it was evident that he understood the character of the country, and we judged the shortest way of reaching the Oregon Trail would be by following him. The footprints of his animal were distinctly marked, and we had no difficulty in keeping them. At noon we forded a stream, and shortly after another, both considerably less than the Republican Fork. On the northern bank of the latter were the still glowing coals of the stranger's campfire, and we judged he could be at no great distance. The country here was of a slightly different character from the rolling prairie over which we had journeyed thus far. There were hills quite elevated, and now and then groves of timber. In the river bottoms were numerous cottonwoods and elder. These natural causes so obstructed our view that we might approach our unknown enemy very nigh without knowing it. Nat was quite nervous, and invariably sheered off from the forbidding groves of timber, striking the trail upon the opposite side at a safe distance. In this way we traveled onward through the entire day. No signs of Indians were seen, and we anticipated little trouble from them, as they were friendly at this time, and the most they would do would be to rob us of some of our trinkets or rifles. At sundown, we left our guiding trail and struck off toward a small stream to camp for the night. When we reached it and decided upon the spot, Nat remarked seriously, "I say, Relman, that feller might be near enough to give us another shot afore morning, and I'm going to see whether his trail crosses the brook out there or not." So saying, he wheeled and ran back to the spot where we had left it. It was still bright enough to follow it, and bending his head down to keep it in view, he continued upon a rapid run. I was upon the point of warning him against thus running into danger, but not feeling much apprehension for his safety, I turned my back toward him. A minute after, I heard his footsteps again, and looking up, saw him coming full speed with me, his eyes dilated to their utmost extent, and with every appearance of terror. "He's there!" he exclaimed. "Where?" I asked, catching his excitement. "Just across the stream up there. I'd like to have run right into him afore I knowed it. See there." As Nat spoke, I saw the glimmering of a fire through the trees, and heard the whinny of a horse. "Didn't he see you?" "Yes, I know he did. When I splashed into the water like a fool, he looked up at me and grunted. I seen him pick up his rifle, and then I put, expecting each moment to feel a ball in me." "I thought you intended laying hands on him if an opportunity offered," I remarked with a laugh. "I declare I forgot that," he replied, somewhat crestfallen. After some further conversation, I decided to make the acquaintance of the person who had occupied so much of our thoughts. Nat opposed this and urged me to get farther from him, but a meaning hint changed his views at once, as he readily acquiesced. He would not be prevailed upon, however, to accompany me, but promised to come to my aid if I should need help during the interview. So, leaving him, I started boldly up the stream. When I reached the point opposite the stranger's campfire, I stumbled and coughed as to attract his attention. I saw him raise his eyes and hurriedly scan me, but he gave no further evidence of anxiety, and I unhesitatingly sprang across the stream and made my way toward him. Before I halted, I saw that he was a trapper. He was reclining upon the ground before a small fire and smoking a short black pipe, in a sort of dreamy reverie. "Good evening, my friend," I said, cheerfully approaching within a few feet of him. He raised his eyes a moment, and then suffered them lazily to fall again, and continue their vacant stare into the fire. "Quite a pleasant evening," I continued, seating myself near him. He grunted, removing his pipe, and rising to the upright position. He looked at me a second with a pair of eyes of sharp, glittering blackness, and then asked, "Chaw, stranger?" "I sometimes use the weed, but not in that form," I replied, handing a piece back to him. He wrenched off a huge mouthful with a vigorous twist of his head and returned it without a word. This done, he sank back into his former position and reverie. "Excuse me, friend," said I, moving rather impatiently and determined to force a conversation upon him, "but I hope you will permit a few questions?" "Go ahead, stranger," he answered gruffly. "Are you traveling alone in this section?" "I reckon I are, 'cept the hoss which are a team." "Fellow trapping and hunting, I presume?" "What's your handle, stranger?" he suddenly asked, as he came to the upright position and looking at me with more interest. "William Relmond, from New Jersey." "Where's that place?" "It is one of the middle states, quite a distance from here." "What might you be doing in these parts?" "I and my friend out yonder are on our way to Oregon." "Huh! You're pretty greenins." "Now I suppose you'll have no objection to giving me your name?" "My handle's Bill Biddon, and I'm on my way to trapping grounds up country." "How far distant?" "A heap, somewhere up above the Yallerstone." "Do you generally go upon these journeys alone?" "Sometimes I does, and sometimes I doesn't." I ceased my questions for a few moments for fear of provoking him. As his route, as far as it extended, would be in our direction, I determined to keep his company, if I could gain his consent. He was a splendid specimen of the physical man. He was rather short, but heavy and thick-set, with a compactness of frame that showed a terrible strength slumbering in his muscles. His face was broad, covered by a thin, straggling beard of grizzled gray, and several rigid scars were visible in different parts of it. His brows were beetling and lowering, and beneath them a couple of black eyes fairly snapped at times with electric fire. His mouth was broad, and though one could plainly see a whirlwind of terrific passion might be called into life within his breast, yet there was also in his face the index of a heart alive to good humor and frankness. I saw that, if approached skillfully, his heart could be reached. He was evidently the creature of odd whims and fancies and caprice. Feeling as well satisfied without the society of his fellow-man as with it, one of those strange beasts, a hero of 100 perils, who was satisfied to lose his life in the mighty wilderness of the far west, without a single one suspecting or caring for his fate. "Would you have any objections to my friend and myself accompanying you? That is, as far as you should proceed in our direction?" He looked steadily at me a moment, and answered, You can go with me if you want. But I knows as how you're green, and yer needn't suppose I'm going to hold in for yer. Yours just never does that thing." "Oh, I shouldn't expect you to. Of course, we will make it a point not to interfere in the least with your plans and movements." "Where's your other chap? S'pose it were him what come peeking through here a while ago. Had a notion of spilling his picter for his impertinence." "I will go bring him," I answered, rising and moving off. But as I stepped across the stream, I discerned the top of Nat's white hat, just above a small box elder, and moving on, saw his eye fixed with an eager stare upon the trapper. "Don't he look savage?" he whispered as I came to him. "Not very. Are you afraid of him?" "No, but I wonder whether he knows about the old mare and my knife." "Perhaps so. Come and see. He just now asked for you." "Asked for me?" repeated Nat, stepping back. "What does he want of me?" "Nothing in particular. I just mentioned your name, and he asked where you were. Come along. I hope you aren't afraid." "Afraid? I should like to see the man I'm afraid of!" exclaimed my companion in an almost inaudible whisper, as he tremblingly followed me across the brook and to the spot where Biddon, the trapper, was lying. "My friend Nathan Todd, Biddon." "How are you? Very happy to make your acquaintance." And Nat nervously extended his hand. "How are you?" grunted Biddon, with a slight jerk of his head, and not noticing the proffered hand. "Been a most exceedingly beautiful day," ventured Nat, quickly and nervously. I saw the trapper was not particularly impressed with him, and I took up the conversation. I made several unimportant inquiries, and learned in the course of them that our friend Bill Biddon was about 40 years of age, and had followed trapping and hunting for over 20 years. He was a native of Missouri, and Westport was the depot for his peltries. For the last 2 or 3 years he had made all his excursions alone. He was quite a famous trapper, and the fur company which he patronized gave him a fine outfit and paid him well for his skins. He possessed a magnificently mounted rifle, and his horse, he informed me, had few superiors among the fleetest mustangs of the South. Both of these were presented him by the company mentioned. "Why ain't you got horses?" he asked, looking toward me. "They were stolen from us." "I don't suppose you've seen anything of a company with a mare, short-tailed, that limped a little, and an overcoat that had a knife in the pocket?" asked Nat eagerly. "Not that I knows on," answered Biddon, with a twinkle of humor. I gave the particulars of our loss, and then asked, without due thought, "Did you not camp upon the banks of the Republican Fork last night?" "Yes. What'd you want to know for?"
"Oh, nothing," quickly answered Nat. I believe the trapper understood my allusion, and I hoped he would give an explanation of his act, but he made no reference to it, and, after further consideration, we all lay down in slumber. End of Chapter 2.
Chapter 3 of Bill Biddon, Trapper. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynn Thompson. Bill Biddon, Trapper, by Edward Sylvester Ellis. Chapter 3. The Trapper's Story. I was aroused from my slumber before it was yet light, by Biddon shaking me and calling in my ear, "Come, you chaps, you've only got 2 minutes to swaller your feed in." Nat was already moving about, and I sprang to my feet, determined to continue in my friend's good graces, if such a thing were possible, by a cheerful acquiescence in all his reasonable wishes. Our fire was kindled, a hasty breakfast swallowed, and just as the sun made its appearance above the prairie, we moved off toward the north. Long before noon we reached the Platte, and forded it at the point where Fort Grattan now stands. The Platte, during the winter months, is a boisterous stream of great width, but in summer it is very shallow, from which circumstance it derives its name; and at the dry season it almost ceases running, and dwindles down to an innumerable number of stagnant pools. As it was now the summer season, we walked over without more than merely wetting our shoes. The Oregon Trail follows the northern shore of this stream to Washington Territory, or to what was Oregon at the time of which I write. Leaving the Platte, we shaped our course toward the northwest, so as to strike the southern spur of the Black Hills. From Biddon's conversation, I found that his destination was the neighborhood of the headwaters of the Tongue or Powder River, which have their cañons in the Black Hills. As he allowed his horse to proceed upon a moderate walk, we had no trouble in keeping him company. We generally started at the first indication of morning,
halting now and then to slake our thirst in the numerous streams which crossed our path, and resting an hour at noon. At sunset we struck camp upon some small stream, cooked our evening meal, spent an hour or two in smoking and conversation, and turned in for the night. The country over which we now journeyed was much better timbered than any through which we had yet passed. For an entire day after crossing the Platte, we met with thousands of the ash, elm, walnut, and cottonwood trees. The bark of the latter, I was surprised to observe, was greatly relished by the trapper's horse, he often preferring it to the rich succulent grass which so abounds in this region. Besides this there were signs of the buffalo, antelope, and hundreds of other animals. One night we halted upon the bank of a large stream some miles north of the Platte, which emptied into the Missouri. It was quite broad and rapid, and near the center of the channel a small sandy island was visible. We passed over this while fording the stream, and I noticed that Biddon walked around it and surveyed several spots with more than common interest. I did not question him then, but at night, when we were stretched before the fire, with our soothing pipes, I ventured the inquiry. "I seed sights on that chunk of mud one time," said he, with a dark frown. "What was it? What was it?" asked Nat, eagerly. "Here's as what don't like to think of that time. Ugh!" he answered, seeming still unwilling to refer to it. "Why not?" I asked, beginning to partake of Nat's curiosity. "It makes a feller's blood bile. But howsomever," he added, brightening up, "if you wants to hear it, you can." "We do, by all means. Please give it." "Yas, that war a time of general wiping out, and this yer water, that now looks as black as a wolf's mouth, run red that night. It war nigh on 10 year ago that it happened. I was down in Westport one day in the summer when a feller slapped me on the shoulder and axed me if I wanted a job. I tole him I didn't care much, but if he's a mind to fork over, and it wasn't desprit hard, and too much like work, I's his man. He said as how there war a lot of fellers camped out on the prairie, as war gwine to start for Oregon, and as wanted a guide, and hearing me spoken on as suthin' extronnery, why, he like to know if I wouldn't go. He'd make the pay all right. I cut around the stump a while, and at last 'cluded to go. I went out into the parairy and seed the company. They were men, women, and children, 'specially the last ones. I see they wanted a good watchin', and I kinder hinted they'd find trouble afore they'd reach Oregon. There weren't many folks trampin' these parts then, and them as did go had to make up their minds to see fight and hair-raisin'. B'ars and beavers they did. The reds war the same then as all over, arter you get clear of the States, and no feller's ha'r wore his own till he'd lost it. We started the next day, and struck the Platte afore night. There war 20 good men, and I made half of 'em stand watch that night, just to get their hands in. In course they didn't see nothin', 'cept one straddlin' chap, like this feller yer that's called Nat. He said as how he seed wonders, he did, and there war 100 reds crawlin' round the camp all night. We went pretty slow, as it weren't best to hurry the teams, but we hadn't been 2 days on the way afore the fools got into the all firedest scrabble I ever seed. I don't know what it came 'bout, but it war so big they split company, and part of 'em crossed over and camped on t'other side of the Platte. I told 'em they'd see stars pretty soon if they didn't splice agin, but they's too rearin' to do it, and I said if they's a mind to be sich fools they mought be fur all me, and I'd let 'em go on alone. Howsomever the smallest party hung on for me not to leave 'em, and I 'cluded to stay with 'em, as I knowed pretty well they'd need me all the time. The biggest company as had crossed the Platte kept on by it, and so the others said they'd leave it and cut across for Oregon. I told 'em this was the best way, and so we left 'em. Them I war with were a heap the smallest, and had but 3 or 4 men and 5 or 6 women and children. What made things look wuss, I seed signs when we parted, and I knowed pretty well the reds smelt what war going on. And 'bout a dozen times in the afternoon I could see 'em off on the parairy stealin' 'long and dodgin' through cover. I knowed that the imps war follerin' us, seein' the other war a heap more powerful nor us. Things got so dubersome afore night
I said to the men, if they'd take the advice of a feller as knowed what he were 'bout, they'd turn round and never stop till they cotched the others. For if they didn't, they'd cotch it that night. Reds were 'bout them as thick as flies. They said how, if I's 'fraid, I mout go back; but as for them, they'd go through fire and blazes, for they would. I felt riled 'nough at this to leave 'em, and I would if it hadn't been for them poor women. They looked so sorrowful, I made up my mind to stick to 'em for their sake. We reached the stream just as it were growing dark, and the Reds had got so sassy that 5 or 6 of 'em stood a little ways off and watched us. This scarred the women and men, and they axed me what were to be done. The women cried and wanted to coax the Injuns up to give 'em something to get their good will, but they were cross and sulky, and didn't say much. After some talk and a heap of crying, we 'cluded to camp on that piece of sand in the river. The teams were draw over, and we followed. The water was some deeper nor now, and it took us a long time to land, but we got over at last. As soon as we were clean over, I commenced fixing up things for the Reds. We didn't build no fire, but put the teams together near the middle, and the women inside 'em. There were 4 men without me, and I set 'em round the place to watch for sign. I made 'em all squat flat down in the mud close to the water, and told 'em to blaze away at anything they seed, if it were a beaver or otter, and gave 'em particular orders not to wink both eyes at a time. I seed they's scareish, and they weren't no danger of that snoozing on watch. I was pretty sartin the Reds would come some of our tricks and come down the river, so I went up to the upper part of the thing, and laid in the mud myself to watch for 'em. I knowed too they wouldn't be 'bout 'fore purty late, so I took a short nap as I laid in the mud. When I woke up the moon was up in the sky, and the river had riz so my pegs were in the water. I flapped out, but didn't see nothin' yet. I sneaked down round by t'other fellers and found 'em all wide awake, and they said too as how they hadn't seen nothin' 'cept the river war gettin' higher, which they kinder thought the Injuns mout have done. Just as I were going back I heard some of the purtiest singing in the world. First I thought it were an Injun, if it hadn't been so nice. Then I 'cluded it must be an angel. I listened, and found it came from the wagons. I crept up and seed 2 little girls all lone close by the wagons, a singing something. Shoot me if it didn't make me feel watery to see them. The moon was shining down through the flying clouds right out on 'em. They sot with their arms round each other, and were bareheaded, and if I hadn't known 'em, I'd swore they were angels sure. I asked what they was singing for, and they said the Injuns were going to come after 'em that night, and they were singing to their mother in heaven to keep 'em away. Shoot me! When one of 'em throwed her little white arms around my neck and kissed my ugly meat trap, I couldn't stand it. I went up to my place again and laid down in the mud. It was getting colder, and the wind coming up drew the white clouds 'fore the moon, making it all black. But when it come out again I see something coming down the river that looked like a log. I dug down deeper into the mud and set my peepers on it, for I knowed that was something else there too. It came right on and struck the mud a little ways from me. I didn't stir, 'cept to kinder loose my knife. The log stuck a minute, and then swung round and went down the river. I knowed the boys would see it, and I didn't leave my place, thinking as how this were only sent down to see what we'd do. I were looking for other things, when I heard a noise in the water, and shoot me if a sneaking Red didn't come up out of the water and commence crawling while the girls were singing, just a little fodder in the fire. I sprang up and threw on some faggots, and then seated myself and anxiously awaited the rest of his story. He put away his pipe, filled his mouth with tobacco, and after several annoying delays, resumed. There warn't no time to lose. I crept 'long behind him mighty sly, and afore he knowed it, come down spank onto him. I didn't make no noise, nor he either. I just grabbed his gullet and finished him with my knife. I then crawled back agin, and shoot me if I didn't see 40 logs coming down on us. The river were full of 'em. I jumped up and hollered to the other fellers to look out. They came up aside me and stood ready, but it warn't no use. 'Fore we knowed it, I seed over 40 of 'em 'longside us. We blazed into 'em, and went to usin' our knives, but I knowed it wouldn't do. They set up a yell, and pitched for the wagons, while 'bout a dozen went at us. The fust thing I knowed, the whole 4 boys were down and their ha'r raised, and the women screeching murder. It made me desperate, and I reckon I done some tall work that night. Most these beauty spots on my mug came from that scrimmage. I seed a Red dart by me with that little girl that was singing, and cotched a dead Red's gun, and let drive at him, but the guns weren't loaded, and so the devil run off with her. The oxes war bellerin', and the horses snortin', and the tomahawks stoppin' the women's screams. The redskins war howlin' and yellowin' like all mad, and as I got some big cuts and knocks, I 'cluded it best to move quarters. So I made a jump for the stream, took a long dive, and swam for the shore. I come up 'bout where you're sittin', and made a heap of tracks 'fore daylight come." "And did you never hear anything of the children captured upon that night?" "I never seed 'em agin, but I come 'cross a chap at Fort Laramie when I went down agin, what said he seen a gal 'mong some redskins up in these parts, and I've thought p'raps it might have been one of 'em, and agin it moughn't." "Did you say that all happened out there?" asked Nat, jerking his thumb toward the island mentioned without turning his face. "I reckon I did." "Bet there's a lot of Injuns there now!" exclaimed he, turning his head in that direction. "Just as like not," returned Biddon, with a sly look at me. "I'm going to sleep, then," and rolling himself up in his buffalo blanket, all but his feet, disappeared from view. "It's 'bout time to snooze, I think," remarked the trapper in a lower tone, turning toward me. "I think so, but I suppose there need be no apprehension of molestation from Injuns, need there?" Biddon looked at me a moment, then one side of his mouth expanded into a broad grin, and he quietly remarked, "Times are different from what they used to war." "Biddon," said I, after a moment's silence, "before we saw you we camped upon one side of a stream while you were upon the other. Now, I do not suppose you would wilfully harm a stranger, but since I have met you, I have a great desire to know why you fired that shot at Nat. You supposed we were Indians, I presume." A quiet smile illumined the trapper's swarthy visage, and after waiting a moment, he answered: "The way on it war this. I seed you and Nat camping there, and I 'spected you war gwine to tramp these parts. I watched you a while, and I was gwine to sing out for you to come over. Then said I, 'Biddon, you dog, ain't there a chance to give them a powerful scare?' First I drawed bead on you, but when that Nat jumped up I let fly at him, and he kerflummoxed splendid. Howsomever, it's time to snooze, and I'm in for it." With this we wrapped our blankets around us, and in a few moments were asleep. On a clear summer morning we sailed out upon the broad open prairie again. The trapper now struck a direction nearly due northwest toward the Black Hills, and we proceeded with greater speed than before. The face of the country began to change materially. Vast groves of timber met the eye, and the soil became rich and productive. At noon we encountered the most immense drove of buffalo that I ever witnessed. They were to the west of us, and proceeding in a southern direction, cropping the grass clean as they went. Far away, as far as the vision could reach, nothing but a sea of black, moving bodies could be distinguished. I mounted a small knoll to ascertain the size of the drove, but only gained a clearer idea of their enormous number. The whole western horizon, from the extreme northwest to the southwest, was occupied solely by them, and nothing else met the eye. They were not under way, and yet the whole mass was moving slowly onward. The head buffaloes would seize a mouthful of grass, and then move on a few feet and grasp another. Those behind did the same, and the whole number were proceeding in this manner. This constant change of their position gave an appearance to them, as viewed from my standing point, similar to the long heaving of the sea after a violent storm. It was a truly magnificent spectacle. We approached within a short distance. They were more scattered upon the outside, and with a little trouble the trapper managed to insinuate himself among them.
His object was to drive off a cow which had a couple of half-grown calves by her side, but they took the alarm too soon, and rushed off into the drove. We then prepared to bring down one apiece. I selected an enormous bull, and sighted for his head. I approached nigh enough to make my aim sure, and fired. The animal raised his head, his mouth full of grass, and glaring at me a moment, gave snort of alarm, and plunged headlong away into the droves. At the same instant I heard Nat's rifle beside me, and a moment after that of the trapper. This gave the alarm to the herd. Those near us uttered a series of snorts, and dropping their bushy heads, bowled off at a terrific rate. The motion was rapidly communicated to the others, and in a few seconds the whole eastern side was rolling simultaneously onward, like the violent countercurrent of the sea. The air was filled with such a vast cloud of dust that the sun's light was darkened, and for a time it seemed we should suffocate. We remained in our places for over an hour, when the last of these prairie monsters thundered by. A strong wind carried the dust off to the west, and we were at last in clear air again. Yet our appearance was materially changed, for a thin veil of yellow dust had settled over and completely enveloped us, and we were like walking figures of clay. I looked away in the direction of the herd, expecting to see my buffalo's lifeless form, but was considerably chagrined at my disappointment, as was also Nat at his. The trapper's was a dozen yards from where it had been struck. "'Pears to me," he said with a sly smile, "I hearn you dogs bark, but I don't see nothin' of no buffaloes, oh?" "I hit mine," I answered quickly. "I am sure of it." "Whereabouts?" "In the head, plump and square." "Where'd you sight yourn, Greenie?" "Just back of the horns, and I hit him too. If he hasn't dropped before this, I'll bet he'll have the headache for a week." "B'ars and beavers, you! Them bufflers don't mind your shots more nor a couple of hailstones. D'you see where I picked mine?" asked the trapper, pulling the buffalo's foreleg forward, and disclosing the track of the bullet behind it. "Isn't a shot in the head fatal?" I asked in astonishment. "You might hit 'em thar with a cannon ball, and they'd git up and run again, and if you'd pepper 'em all day, where you did yourn, you'd pick the bullets out their ha'r and they wouldn't mind it." This I afterward found to be true. No shot, however well aimed, can reach the seat of life in the buffalo through the head, unless it enter the eye, fair front. The trapper's buffalo was thrown forward upon his face, his legs bent beneath him, and dressed after the usual fashion. He was in good condition, and we had a rich feast upon his carcass. The trapper selected a few choice portions from the inside, relished only by himself, and cutting several huge pieces for future use, the rest was left for the beasts of prey. We proceeded but a few miles further, and encamped upon the banks of the Dry Fork. This is a small stream, a few miles south of the Black Hills. There was but a foot or two of sluggish water, and in the hot season it was often perfectly dry. Here for the first time I was made aware of the changeable character of the climate in this latitude. The weather, thus far, had been remarkably clear and fine, and at noon we found the weather sometimes oppressively warm. Toward night the wind veered round to the northwest and grew colder. At nightfall, when we kindled our fire, the air was so chilly and cutting that Nat and I were in a shiver. Had it not been for our blankets we should have suffered considerably, though Biddon did not call his into requisition. There were a number of cottonwood trees near at hand, which served partly to screen us from the blast. After our evening meal had been cooked, Biddon remarked, "The fire must go out, boys." "Why, do you apprehend danger?" I asked. "Don't know as I do. I hain't seed the signs, but we're gettin' into parts where we've got to be summat skeerish." "I suppose it's about time for the Indians to come?" remarked Nat interrogatively, with a look of fear toward the trapper. "They're 'bout these parts. Min Jack Javin once got into a scrimmage hyar with 'em, when we didn't 'spect it, and just 'cause we let our fire burn while we snoozed. I'd seen signs though then, and wanted to put it out, but he wa'n't afeared." "Let's have ours out, then!" exclaimed Nat excitedly, springing up and scattering the brands around. "Needn't mind 'bout that, it'll go out soon enough." As Nat reseated himself, Biddon continued: "You see, Jarsey, them redskins smell a white man's fire a good way off, and on such a night as this, if they're 'bout, they'll be bound to give him a call. You needn't be afeard, howsomever, to snooze, 'cause they won't be 'bout." It was too cold to enjoy our pipes, and we all bundled up for the night's rest. In a few moments I heard the trapper's deep breathing, and shortly after Nat joined him in sleep. But I found it impossible to get to sleep myself. The ground was so cold that my blanket could not protect me, and the cutting wind was terrible. I used every means that I could devise, but it was of no use, and I feared I should be compelled to either build the fire again, or to continue walking all night to prevent freezing to death. I chose the latter expedient. It was quite dark, yet I had noticed our situation well enough, I judged, not to lose it. So grasping my blanket in my hand, I started on a rapid run directly over the prairie. I continued a long distance, until pretty well exhausted. I turned to retrace my steps. My blood was warming with this exercise, and I hurried forward, counting upon sound sleep for the remainder of the night. I continued my run for a full half hour, and then stopped in amazement as I saw no signs of my companions. Thinking I must have passed the spot where they were lying, I carefully walked back again, but still without discovering the men. I had lost them in the darkness, and it was useless to hunt them at night, so I concluded to wait till morning, feeling sure that they could be at no great distance. I now commenced searching for a suitable place for myself, and at last hit upon a small depression in the prairie. There was a large stone embedded in the earth on one side, which served to protect me from the chilling wind. As I nestled down beside this, such a feeling of warmth and comfort came over me that I congratulated myself upon what at first seemed a misfortune. Lying thus, just on the verge of sleep, my nerves painfully alive to the slightest sound, I suddenly felt a trembling of the ground. At first it seemed a dream, but, as I became fully awake, I started in terror and listened. I raised my head, but heard no sound, and still in the most perplexing wonder sank down again, hoping it would shortly cease. But there was a steady, regular increase, and presently I distinguished millions of faint tremblings, like the distant mutterings of thunder. Gradually these grew plainer and more distinct, and finally I could distinguish sounds like the tread of innumerable feet upon the prairie. Still at a loss to account for this strange occurrence, I listened, every nerve in my body strung to its highest tension. Still louder and louder grew the approaching thunder, and every second the jar of earth became more perceptible. Suddenly the truth flashed upon me. A herd of buffaloes were approaching. Terror for an instant held me dumb when I realized this awful danger. My first resolve was to rush forth and warn Nat and Biddon, but I reflected that they must have been awakened ere this, and that I could do nothing to ward off the peril which threatened all alike. Springing to my feet, I paused a second to collect my tumultuous thoughts. Could I reach the timber, I could ascend a tree and be beyond danger, but I knew not what direction to take, and there was no time to spare. To remain still was to be trampled to death. To rush away could save me but a few moments longer. God of heaven, what a death! Louder and louder grew the thundering tread of the animals, and I stood like a madman, the cold sweat pouring off me, tormented by 1,000 agonizing thoughts, and expecting death each moment. Nearer and nearer came the rattle of the clamping hoofs, and I stood rooted to the spot. Sinking on my knees, I implored mercy of the one who could give it in this moment of dire necessity, and while on my knees, the means of preservation presented itself. "Strange!" I exclaimed, breathing deeply, "that I did not think of it before." I have said that I was in a sort of depression or hollow in the earth, and that a large stone was embedded on one side. Now a safer and more secure shelter could not have been found in this emergency. I wrapped my blanket around me, and crept as far beneath it as I could, and I was saved. A few minutes later, and a large body plunged headlong over me with the rapidity of lightning, followed instantly by another and another, and I knew the herd were thundering past. For a long time I lay there, beneath these thousands of feet, one of which would have been sufficient to kill me. The incessant crackling of their hoofs, the rattling of their horns, sounded like the discharge of musketry. Once a ponderous body tumbled over the rock which sheltered me, and I caught sight of a dark, writhing, bellowing mass, and the next instant it regained its feet and disappeared. It must have been an hour that I lay there ere the last animal leaped over me. Then I looked up and saw the stars shining overhead. My joy at the sight of those glittering orbs cannot be expressed. I arose to my feet and looked about me. It was too dark to discern objects, yet I could hear the rapidly retreating footfalls of the herd in the distance, and I knew I had been saved from a frightful death. Sinking to the earth, I offered a sincere prayer of gratitude to the Almighty for his miraculous preservation of my life. End of chapter 3.
Chapter 4 of Bill Biddon, Trapper. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Bill Biddon, Trapper, by Edward Sylvester Ellis. Chapter 4 The Trapping Grounds. I was agreeably surprised upon waking to see Nat standing within a few feet, holding 2 horses by the bridle. "Which one will you choose?" he asked with a broad smile. "How did you come by them?" asked I. "I suppose it must have been about the time you left us last night that Biddon woke me up and told me to follow him, as there was a powerful chance to get a couple horses for you and me. I asked him where you could be, and he said he supposed you'd gone further upstream to sleep by yourself, though he hadn't seen you go. Howsomever, we wasn't worried, as we thought you were old enough to take care of yourself. So we started down the bed of the stream. We went about half a mile when Biddon showed me a small campfire, burned down to a few coals and ashes, but there was enough light to show us 2 horses picketed a few yards away, and we seen the feet of a couple of redskins turned toward the fire. Biddon said as how they was a couple of hunters sound asleep, and we might borrow their horses if I didn't make too much noise. He told me to stand still and keep my gun pointed at them, and the minute one stirred, to shoot him, and then rush in and dispatch the other. I promised to do so, and he stole around to the horses on his hands and knees. He had cut both the lariats and was leading them away, when one of the Indians raised his head and looked around, and as soon as he seen the horses moving off, give a grunt and jumped up and ran toward them. I remembered it was my duty to shoot, and as the Indian was running pretty fast, I aimed about 10 feet ahead of him, supposing, of course, the villain would get there as soon as the bullet did. But I'll be hanged if he wasn't mean enough to stop and let the bullet be wasted. My gun kicked like blazes, and the Injuns, I suppose, thought a whole tribe was upon them, for setting up a great howl, they scooted off in the darkness, leaving us alone with the animals. Running back, I overtook Biddon, who was riding along as though nothing had happened. He asked me to ride, and of course I jumped on, and here I am. But which horse do you want?" "I do not see that there is much room for choice," I replied. "Both are splendid animals, and a most opportune blessing. If it's all the same to you, this gentleman is mine." And handing the bridle to me, he vaulted upon the other. The latter was a magnificent Indian pony of a deep bay color, probably captured when very young, and high-spirited and fiery. Both manifested considerable uneasiness, knowing they were in the hands of strangers, and Nats made 1 or 2 efforts to dislodge him, but he was a good horseman, and maintained his place with apparent ease despite the struggles, which were frantic and desperate at first. Mine was somewhat larger, of a coal-black color, and with as much spirit and fire as the other, but in a few moments we had them both under perfect control. Besides these two animals, we gained two fine Indian saddles, and were now as well mounted as we could wish. Nat remarked that, when the buffaloes thundered by, he felt some apprehension for me, but the trapper expressed none, saying that I would be found all right in the morning. As soon as there was light, Nat commenced searching the bed of the stream for me, and failing in this, he climbed a tree and took a survey of the prairie on both sides. From his elevation he discovered what he believed to be my dead body, and, accompanied by Biddon and the horses, hastened toward me. Upon reaching me, they understood instantly the whole matter, and it was their loud laughter that had aroused me. We were now pretty far to the northwest of Nebraska Territory. The face of the country was materially different, and I began to notice a change of temperature. The summer had just closed, and the early autumn was like the approach of winter. The nights were cool and chilling, and the days generally mild at noon, but often keen and exhilarating. The prairie was mostly of the rolling kind, but the belts of timber were more common, and the vegetation richer and more exuberant. It was plain, too, that we were journeying into a section where the foot of civilization had not been. The vast undulating swell of the prairie, the mighty fields of verdure, and the broad rivers and streams bore only the marks of the red man and the wild beast. Toward noon, Nat descried a solitary antelope far ahead. It was near a grove of timber from which it had just wandered, and stood gazing wonderingly at our approach. We rode on in silence for some time, when Biddon raised his hand for us to halt. "What do you intend doing?" I asked. "Just hold on and see," he replied, as he dismounted. He made a circuit, skirting the prairie, so as to reach the grove mentioned upon the opposite side from the antelope. I still was at a loss to understand his intention, as the animal was too distant from the timber to be brought down with a rifle shot from that point. "What under the sun does he intend doing?" I asked, turning to Nat. "Guess he's getting off there to shoot us." On the outer edge of the grove, next to the antelope, I saw him emerge holding a stick over his head, to which was affixed a handkerchief or rag. He walked a short distance, and then lay down flat upon the prairie, perfectly concealed in the grass. The rag was visible fluttering above him. I now watched the motions of the antelope. He stood gazing at us until the trapper came into view, when, with a startled glance at him, he wheeled and ran. In a moment, however, he paused and turned quickly around. His looks were now fixed upon the fluttering signal. He stood motionless a moment, and then, cautiously lifting his foot, made a step toward it. Thus he continued to approach, step by step, with apparent fear, and yet evidently impelled by an ungovernable curiosity, until he was scarce 100 yards distant from the prostrate form of the trapper. Still he was moving stealthily onward, when suddenly a red tongue of fire spouted from the grass, and as the sharp crack of Biddon's rifle reached us, we saw the antelope give a wild leap into the air, and, bounding a short distance, fall to the ground. The trapper immediately sprang to his feet and hastened to the fallen animal. "Let's ride to him," said I, walking my horse onward. We had ridden a short distance when Nat halted and asked, "What's got into Biddon? Just look at him." I did look up, and for a moment believed the man had turned crazy. He had seen us approaching, and was now making furious gesticulations toward us. I watched him a moment, and then remarked, "He is either signaling for us to come on or to stop. He means us to wait, I guess, and we'd better pause until he returns." We reined in our horses and watched him. He was apparently satisfied with our stopping, and stooped and commenced working at the animal. In a few moments he arose, and slinging a huge piece on his shoulder, made his way into the grove. From this he emerged in due time, and made his way toward us, motioning meanwhile for us to remain in our places. "Why didn't you wish us to approach?" I asked as soon as he came within speaking distance. He made no answer, but throwing his meat upon the ground, hastily mounted his horse. Then he spoke in a deep whisper. "Boys, did you s'pose there's over 20 redskins among them trees?" "Heavens! It isn't possible!" I exclaimed, catching my breath. "It's so. I seed 'em, and their eyes are on us at this minute. They're waiting for us to go on, and they'll give us thunder and lightning." "What's to be done?" queried Nat. "Just keep still and don't kick up, or they'll see it. We've got to make a run for it. Keep close to me, and when I start, let your horses went." "But the meat?" I hurriedly asked. "Can't take it. We have a long run, and our horses won't want to carry no extra load." I didn't see their animals, but I guess they ain't mounted. "Ready!" With this, Biddon wheeled his horse quickly around, and vanished from his place with the speed of lightning, while ours almost simultaneously shot ahead like an arrow. An instant after, I heard the faint discharge of guns, and looking back, saw a host of savage forms pouring hastily from the timber. "No need of hurrying, they are not mounted," I called out to Nat, who was hurrying his horse to the utmost. "I don't believe it!" he exclaimed, still speeding furiously onward. "Go it, Todd! You'll fetch up at Fort Laramie!" yelled Biddon. The latter drew his horse into a steady canter, and indulged in several loud laughs at the flying fugitive. Nat continued his mad career until he had gone a good distance, when, seeing how far behind he had left us, he reined up and awaited our approach. The savages, in the meantime, were hurrying on in pursuit. I know not what led them to expect any success in this chase, for, as remarked, not one was mounted. They may have had little faith in the speed or bottom of our horses, and trusted they would be able to run us down. Biddon half turned in his seat, and looking back a moment, asked, "Do you see that red digging like all mad off on one side, the one as is trying to surround us?" I glanced back, and answered in the affirmative. "Do you want to see a red drop in pretty style?" I answered again in the affirmative. "Well, just keep your peeper on him." So saying, he raised his rifle, without checking the speed of his horse, took a quick aim along its long barrel, and fired. To my astonishment, the Indian mentioned uttered a wild shriek, and springing high in the air, fell to the earth. "He's done for," remarked the trapper, quietly, while I foddered my iron. "Supposing you try your hand." I raised mine to my shoulder, and pointing it toward a conspicuous savage, pulled the trigger. As might be expected, I came about as near to him as I did to Nat, in front. "It will take a long time for me to accomplish that feat," said I. "Well, here goes again." And again was the fatal rifle discharged, and again did a savage bite the dust. Still the pursuers maintained their ground, seemingly determined to overtake us at all hazards. They were separating and scattering over the prairie, with the evident intention of hemming us in. At this moment we came up to Nat. "Why don't you run?" he asked impatiently. "They'll shoot us afore we know it." He had scarcely finished his words when the pursuers did fire, and with an uncomfortable effect, too. The bullets were plainly heard whistling through the air beside us, and one actually cut its way through the upper part of Nat's hat, some 8 or 10 inches from the crown of his head. He dodged nervously, and jerking the hat off his head, held it up to view. "Just look there!" he exclaimed, indignantly putting his finger through the orifice. "What of it?" gruffly asked Biddon. "That's a pretty question to ask, I should think. I swear I won't stand any such work as this." And giving his horse the rein, he shot rapidly ahead. "I guess we might as well," remarked Biddon, letting his horse have free rein. The race was now decided. At such speed as we went, of course the pursuers were soon left behind. and in an hour not one was visible, all of them being either distanced or having voluntarily withdrawn. Our course was southwest, so that we had lost considerable ground, and were obliged to make a long detour to regain the trail. We camped at night about as far south as the previous camp, but farther west. In the morning we struck due north, and continued in this direction for several days. It is not necessary to give the particulars of our journey to the northwest. We continued traveling onward for 3 days, when we reached the region where it was intended we should remain until spring. This was much further northward than I suspected. In fact, it was but a few miles distant from the Hudson Bay territory, and upon one of the remote tributaries of the Missouri. We had entered a climate that even now was like the winter of the one we had left. We had entered a mighty wilderness, where, ere we left it, we were doomed to pass through some strange experiences, and of which I now shall speak. We had detected signs of beavers at several streams we had crossed during the last day or two of our journey, but Biddon paid no attention to them until about the middle of the afternoon, when we reached a small river flowing nearly due south and passing through the Hudson Bay territory in its course. This stream we forded, and as we reached the opposite side, he remarked, "Here's the spot where we're going to squat." It is perhaps worth remarking that the section was a wooded country. We had passed over no clear prairie during the day, and were in the midst of a deep wood. The trees were of nearly every conceivable kind, the cottonwood predominating, with oak, elm, ash, walnut, and such as are common in our own forests. After crossing, the trapper headed directly upstream for a short distance, when he turned to the left and descended into a valley. Here he dismounted. "Take your fixins," said he, "and turn the horses loose." "Won't they wander away?" I asked. "Yourn may, but mine won't. You've got to take your chances, though. 'Tain't likely they'll be 'sturbed, 'cept by grizzlies and reds." The spot selected was a broad bottom of rich grass, enclosed by thick walls of undergrowth upon every side. Here we left our horses, and taking our saddles and trappings, moved away. "Have you ever been here before?" I asked of the trapper. "I stayed here last season, but didn't 'spect to come back. Howsomever, I changed my mind, and here we is. Move keerful, and don't make a big trail." We followed nearly a quarter of a mile directly upstream, when he halted and looked carefully about him. "I don't s'pose there's reds about, but there's no telling where they is. I didn't see none last year, but they might be about now. Just hold on a minute." The banks of the stream were fringed by a deep undergrowth upon both sides. Stepping forward to the water's edge, the trapper parted the branches, and glancing a moment within, motioned for us to approach. "It's all right," said he. "There hain't been no reds poking about here while I was gone." With this he stooped and pushed a small canoe into the water, and slipped within it. We joined him, although our combined weight brought the frail vessel down to its very gunwales. It was made of bark after the Indian fashion, very light but strong. Biddon dipped a long Indian paddle in the water, and we moved slowly upstream. After going a short distance, he again touched the bank, and from beneath another lot of shrubbery drew forth a number of beaver traps. These were similar to the common trap used in all parts of the world, and set much after the same fashion, but with a very different bait. At every point where signs of the animals were visible, he dug down the bank so as to make a certain spot perpendicular. Just beneath the surface of the water he then placed the trap. The next and last proceeding was to smear the banks around with a very odoriferous oil, obtained from the beaver itself. This smell attracts the beavers in the vicinity, who immediately swim to the shore to learn more of it. The trap is so arranged that one is sure to place his foot directly upon it for support in ascending the bank, and the natural consequence follows. he is caught, and falls into his mortal enemy's hands. "If one don't have a dinner on beaver tails tomorrow, then I'm a beaver," remarked Biddon, after he had set all his traps and headed his canoe downstream. "A dinner on beaver tails!" exclaimed Nat in astonishment. "That must be a fine dinner, I swear." "If you had read much of these animals, you would know that the part mentioned by Biddon is the most delicious and nourishing portion," said I. "And when you gets a bite of it, you'll find it so, I reckons." "Perhaps so," replied Nat, doubtingly. "But where are you going to take us?" "You'll find out when we get there." The trapper rowed the canoe quite a distance downstream, when he sheered it into shore, close to where a huge chestnut, larger than any I had ever before witnessed, overhung the water. Its base was enveloped by a mass of undergrowth, denser than common, and we were obliged to stoop to the edge of the boat before we could make our way beneath it. As we sprang up the bank, it pulled up behind us, and I then noticed that the chestnut was hollow, and had a deep orifice at its base. "Foller," commanded Biddon, stooping and crawling beneath it. We did so, although there was some hesitation on my part, and my astonishment was unbounded at what I witnessed when within. At first there was nothing visible but the intense darkness, and I stood, fearful of advancing or retreating. "Where are you, Biddon?" asked Nat in a slightly wavering tone. The next instant the trapper struck a light, and as its rays filled the chamber, I repeat, my astonishment was unbounded. We were standing in an open space, at least 8 feet in diameter. The chestnut was but a mere shell, with its trunk but a few inches in thickness at the most. The interior of this was fitted up like a house. The rotten chunks upon the sides had been torn down, and formed a pleasant velvety carpet beneath the feet. All around the walls were hung numerous furs, and a pile at one side afforded a bed, such as we had not enjoyed for weeks. Added to all this, there was an arrangement so as to make it perfectly easy and convenient to kindle a fire. Nat was the first to express his unbounded astonishment. "This beats all. I never seen anything like it. But don't the Injuns know anything of it?" "No, sir, and I calc'late as how they won't neither, if you don't tell them." "Oh, I won't tell them. I swear this is queer." And he looked slowly about and above him. "What's that hole for?" he asked, pointing to a small orifice just visible far above us. "That's for the smoke to go out." "But it must be likely to attract attention," I remarked. "I never start a fire except at night." "I see. Wonderful." And I, too, gazed admiringly about me. The light made the whole interior visible. The dark, snuff-colored fragments of decayed wood hung in ponderous masses above us, and the immense diameter gradually tapered as it ascended, until only the small opening far above was seen, resembling a faint star. The thickness of the wood, together with the great number of furs, protected us so well from the cold that there could be little need of fire in the coldest weather, except for cooking purposes. This is rather odd, I allow to you, Jersey, but if you had been with me down on the Yellowstone, you'd seen something as would have made you look, you would. You may shoot me if you wouldn't." "I suppose I should, but not more than this has." "Maybe not. But don't stand gaping there all day. It's getting dark, and we'll have our fodder." The fire was now started, and the smoke ascended finely, escaping at the outlet. A good slice of meat was cooked, and we made a hearty supper upon it. After this, the fire was allowed to slumber, but the light remained burning until a late hour. We lit our pipes and chatted dreamily for a long time in our new home. The trapper, feeling in the mood, related many reminiscences of his life, including adventures both tragical and comical, and Nat gave a few of his own experiences. At a late hour we ceased, and fell into a peaceful, dreamless slumber. When I awoke, the trapper had disappeared. Nat was stretched beside me, still asleep. In a short time, the former entered as noiselessly as he had departed. "What fortune?" I asked. "Good. Had 2 fat fellers. Wake up, and we'll have a meal as is a meal." Nat soon made a movement, and after several yawns became fully awake. The trapper kindled a small fire, and cooked his beaver tails. The 2 made as choice and delicious a meal as I have ever eaten. Nat was convinced by one taste. The day was clear and pleasant, and Biddon expressed his determination of going up the stream, in order to see the signs of game. I accompanied him, but Nat chose to remain at home and sleep a few hours longer. We sauntered carelessly forth up the stream through the tangled underwood. It was a clear day in autumn. The air was keen and bracing, and the woods gloriously fine. Some of the leaves were just beginning to fall, and they made a dappled and fiery carpet for our feet, rustling with a soft, pleasant sound at every step. Now and then we could hear the shrill notes of some songster of the forest, and once or twice the faint bay of some distant animal. We had wandered some distance when Biddon proposed turning back, as he had just discovered he had forgotten his pipe. I was too well pleased, however, with the prospect to retrace my footsteps. Accordingly, we parted company for a time, he remarking that probably he would return when he had regained his indispensable article. Left alone, I now wandered dreamily onward in a pleasant reverie, hardly conscious of what I was doing, until I was recalled to my senses by the grandeur of a new scene that suddenly burst upon my view. I had ascended a small rise on the bank of the stream, from which I had an extended view of the river. I stood for a moment wrapped in the glories of the scene. Far behind could be discerned the broad bosom of the river, stretching away like a vast body of molten silver, bordered on either side by the mighty forest, until it disappeared in a sweeping curve within the interminable wilderness. Above me, for several miles, the same winding course could be seen, brightly glistening for miles. Not a ripple disturbed the surface, save when a bird skimmed over it, just tipping its wings, and making a flashing circle or two. The blue sky above, unflecked by a single cloud, harmonized so well with the magnificent view, that I stood a long time drinking in the splendor of the scene. My eye was still resting upon the glistening bend of the river above, when the quietness of the scene was interrupted by a dark speck, which suddenly came in view around a curve about a mile above. At first I supposed it to be some animal or log floating upon the surface, but as I looked at it, I saw to my astonishment that it was a canoe coming downstream. Several forms were visible, yet their number at that distance was uncertain. The bright flash of their paddles was visible in the morning sunshine, and they maintained their place near the center of the stream. I scrutinized them vainly to make out their number, until it occurred to me that it would be best to make myself invisible. The approaching canoe might contain nothing but Indians, and it was not desirable that our presence in this section should be known to any but ourselves. I slipped behind the trunk of a tree, nearer the water, yet still upon the elevated knoll, which entirely concealed my body from sight. From this point I watched the approach of the canoe with interest. Soon it came nigh enough to enable me to distinguish the forms within it. There were 2 Indian warriors, seated each with a paddle in his hand, but not using them except to keep the canoe in the channel, and in the stern, with a guiding oar, sat a young female. I supposed her a squaw belonging to the same tribe with her companions, and scrutinized her as closely as my position would permit. She wore a beautiful headdress, gaily ornamented with stained porcupine quills and beads, and a brilliant crimson shawl enveloped her slight form. The savages maintained their places as motionless as statues, their gaze apparently resting upon the stream behind them, while that of the female was fixed upon the stream in front, and her whole attention absorbed in directing her canoe. I know not whether the inmates discovered me before I concealed myself, but I fancied that I detected a glance of the Indians at my hiding place as they floated slowly by, and some cause led the female, when directly opposite, and but a few hundred feet distant, to turn her face toward me. Judge of my astonishment at perceiving that she was not an Indian, but a white woman. Her appearance, as she turned her gaze directly upon the spot where I was standing, I can never forget. She was so close at hand, and my view so perfect in the clear sunlight, that I saw every feature. The pale white face, surrounded by dark luxuriant hair falling upon the shoulders, the dark eyes shaded by long inky lashes, and the mute, untranslatable look, haunted me for many a night after. She merely glanced toward me, and slowly floated past. Dropping upon my hands and knees, I crept hastily from the knoll into the undergrowth below, and made my way hurriedly but noiselessly to the stream. I could not have been over a minute in so doing, but when I reached the water and peered through the bushes, not a trace of the canoe was visible. I looked closely into each shore, up and down the stream, everywhere that I could look, but could not detect the slightest ripple or movement to account for this mysterious disappearance. For over an hour I waited in the hope that the canoe would reappear, but I saw nothing more of it. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of Bill Biddon, Trapper. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Bill Biddon, Trapper, by Edward Sylvester Ellis. Chapter 5. Conversations and Plans. The disappearance of the canoe, although singular in itself, had nothing supernatural about it. The shrubbery which overhung the water on either shore offered a secure and impenetrable hiding place, and a few dexterous, vigorous strokes of the paddles were all that was needed to send it beneath their shadows. That this had been done was plainly evident, yet why had it been done? What motive was there for concealment? And why, if apprehensive of danger, had the Indians waited until they were in its vicinity? These and numerous questions I asked myself as I carefully retraced my steps downstream again. The whole proceeding was mysterious to me. I had doubtless exposed myself while watching the canoe and its occupants, and thus betrayed to an enemy our presence in their country. What would result from this I could not conjecture, and determined to make everything known to the trapper. But then I felt somewhat fearful of this. He would doubtless be incensed at my imprudent thoughtlessness, which might compel him to leave a country offering such inducements to the trapper and fur trade. And I argued it was not certain that I had really been seen by the Indians in question. If they meditated hostility, Biddon would be warned soon enough for all purposes, and so I decided to keep my own secret for the present. But the question which occupied my thoughts, almost to the exclusion of everything else, was the identity of the female in the canoe. What could bring a white maiden to these wild regions of the Northwest? What meant her appearance in the canoe with two savage Indian warriors? What if she was the child which Biddon had referred to as being captured upon the night of the massacre? This thought intensified the interest I already felt in her. I believed she had seen me, and her silent look toward the shore had something more than curiosity in it. I imagined there was a mute, eloquent appeal in those dark eyes. Still ruminating upon this all-absorbing theme, I reached the tree, and, stooping upon my hands and knees, crawled within it. The movement had well nigh cost me my life. As my head entered, I encountered the alarmed visages of Nat and Biddon, the latter with his knife drawn, and just preparing to spring upon me. "You like to got rubbed out that time," he exclaimed, replacing his weapon. "What made you forget the sign?" "It must have been because it didn't occur to me," I laughed. "I've had no occasion to use it before, and forgot it altogether. But I will remember it, you may be assured, in future." "You'd better, for I was just going to shoot, too," added Nat, rising to his feet, and then seating himself again. "You shoot!" repeated Biddon, contemptuously. "Your shooter ain't loaded." "I forgot that. I wonder if I couldn't load it, say?" he indignantly demanded. "Yes, in course, if the reds waited for you." Nat made no reply to this, except that of instantly proceeding to load his piece. As it were near noon, the meal was prepared, this time from the beaver's body. The hair was singed off from a piece, which was then cooked in the usual manner. This, although very palatable, was not equal to the tail of the animal, the meat being more tough and oily. Shortly after, the trapper departed for the purpose of visiting his traps and setting new ones. When alone with Nat, I determined to impart to him my morning's experience. "Nat, I have seen Indians," I remarked in a quiet tone. "You hain't!" he exclaimed, starting up from his bed of skins with such suddenness as to break the remains of his pipe. "I have, and what is considerably more, they have seen me." "I should think it was considerably more. Huh! What did you do to them? I didn't hear you shoot. Why didn't you tell me before? Why didn't you?" "Why, it seems to me you're very cool about it. There is no occasion for excitement at all. Just remain quiet, and I will tell you how it all happened." And thereupon I related the particulars of the incident already known to the reader. Nat's wonder, excitement, and apprehension were roused to the highest pitch at the narration. Springing to his feet, he pulled his flattened hat violently over his forehead, and striding about a moment, demanded, "Why didn't you tell Bill? Like as not, he'll be shot and scalped before he gets back." "I did not think it best," I returned. "Biddon is not the man to walk into danger with his eyes shut, and if there is any cause for fear, he will discover it soon enough." "S'pose he will. But ain't it terrible?" "Isn't what terrible?" "Why, that we're surrounded by Injins thirsting for our blood." "We are not surrounded by Indians, Nat," I returned reprovingly. "I know, but then they are all around us. It won't do to stick our heads out, except at night, and then, like as not, we'll be shot for our trouble." "You are not afraid, I hope?" "Oh, no, not a bit. But then, you know, it's rather unpleasant to feel that those infernal Blackfeet, because this is the country of the Blackfeet Injuns, are all about you and waiting for a chance to shoot you from behind every bush." "Nat," I commenced earnestly, "you say you are not afraid of Indians, and yet you show it in every word, look, and action." "There's no excuse for this. I saw only two savages and a girl, evidently a captive. No words or actions were exchanged between us. They disappeared very suddenly, and were more probably frightened at my presence. I see nothing in this to excuse the excitement and terror you have exhibited. I wonder what that girl is. I am afraid you will have to wonder a long time, as I can see no occasion for satisfying your curiosity." "Is she good looking?" asked my companion seriously. "Very. What makes you ask that question?" "I declare if I don't marry her, just to spite Almany, and make Bill Hawkins mad!" he exclaimed joyously. At this point I could restrain my mirth no longer, but, as I indulged it, I was considerably surprised to feel a slight twinge of jealousy at his words. This discovery was painful. "I am afraid you will meet with several formidable obstacles before you can accomplish that." the most difficult of which will be to obtain an audience with the fair one herself. Don't suppose she'd be very anxious to see me, and I wouldn't care if I only had my pipe and jackknife to pass away time with. I think it would be as well not to mention this affair to Biddon." "Why not?" "It can do no good, and he would be displeased at the thoughtlessness I have evidenced. I do not think there are savages enough in the vicinity to render us fearful of our safety. The canoe, I'm disposed to believe, belongs to some tribe quite distant from here. But what are they here for? I can only conjecture. Biddon has never seen savages in this particular section, and these may be returning from some journey to their tribe. Perhaps so, and maybe not. These plagued Injuns sometimes live in one place and sometimes in another, you know, and it may be that a notion has just entered their heads to come and live in these parts." "There is reason in what you say, but as I stated, if danger threatens, Biddon will undoubtedly detect its signs himself in time." "I think he will, though I shall feel a little flustered every time he goes out. You remember when he was after the antelope, he walked right among the Injuns, without knowing it till it was too late to stop." "He did, it's true, but how nicely he walked out again. I tell you, Nat, that fellow has nerve equal to any emergency. What man, when conscious of an overwhelming foe being concealed within a few feet of him, could have repressed every sign of trepidation or fear as he did, and bring the antelope through the same fearful ordeal with the same coolness and deliberation? That was a clever thing, I allow. Biddon told me he felt a little nervous when he saw us start to come up to him, for if we had reached him, it would have been all up with us. He called out to us, though we did not hear him, that there were more animals in the grove, and our approach would frighten them. The impatient Indians were thus held at bay, in the hope of being offered a better opportunity to accomplish our ruin, until it was too late to accomplish anything, save the loss of 2 or 3 of their number. Such a man, I repeat, will scent danger soon enough without the help of others." "He will, and I hope he'll find out who that white girl is." "Nat, do you remember the account Biddon gave some time ago of a horrible massacre upon the sandy island near where we encamped one night? I don't think there's much likelihood in my ever forgetting it. You will also recall his account of the capture of a small child by the savages. Now it has occurred to me that this is that child grown to womanhood." "I know it is," exclaimed Nat, joyously. "It is true there's much against it. It was a great distance from here, but as these savages wander hundreds of miles at times, it is not improbable upon that ground. Instances are only too common of persons spending their lives in captivity among these Indian tribes. She is a captive, beyond a doubt, and must long for restoration to her home and friends. If possible, I am bound to know more of her." "So am I," exclaimed my excitable companion. "As I said, we will say nothing of this to Biddon until he discovers signs of the Indians himself. Tomorrow we will go forth together, and spend the day in endeavoring to gain traces of the canoe and its inmates, and if anything is discovered which is alarming, we will impart it to him." This Nat agreed to, and shortly after we heard 3 raps upon the outside of the tree, the trapper's signal of his presence. A moment after he made his appearance. He was considerably elated at his prospect for a goodly quantity of furs, had set a number of traps, was sure of half a dozen next day, had seen no signs of Indians, and was convinced there were none in the vicinity. None of us passed out again that day, but remained, indulging in our pipes and conversation as usual, until a late hour. The next morning the trapper proposed that I should accompany him upon his daily round. I complied, while Nat remained behind. The day was as warm and pleasant as the preceding one, and the forest and stream as delightful. Biddon paddled slowly up the unrippled surface, and in a short time reached the first trap. It had not been disturbed. Still hopeful, he passed on to the second and third and all the others, but there were no signs of beaver in any. "Shoot me, that's queer!" he exclaimed thoughtfully as he saw the last one. "I don't understand it. I must get out and take a look around." He sprang ashore and minutely examined the ground around. A few seconds sufficed. He looked up with a gleam of deep meaning and said, "Here's the track of a thunderin' moccasin. The Reds have found us out." He stepped into the canoe, and taking the paddle, moved it carefully back again. He touched at each trap on the way. The footprints of a stranger were visible at each. "There's been a beaver taken out of that one," he remarked as the last one was reached. "It's lucky for that sneaking coward that I didn't see him. He wouldn't disturbed any more gentlemen's traps. Are you sure it's an Indian that's been annoying you?" "Ho! Don't you suppose I could tell a Red's track from a grizzly's?" "But it might have been a white man, some hunter or trapper," I suggested. "A white man wouldn't be mean enough to do such a thing, 'less it were some of those Hudson Bay fellers. They try them tricks sometimes, but they get come up to. I catched a feller once from Fort Hall at mine, and the way I walked into him were a caution. But this are an Injun's track, sure." "Do you suspect there could be a number in the vicinity?" "If there war, I'd 'a' heard of 'em afore. This is some varmint sneaking round here, and he's got to be rubbed out 'fore he makes more trouble." "I fear that will be a difficult and dangerous job." "Let me be for that." Shortly after, we reached our home, and running the canoe beneath the bushes, entered it. We were somewhat surprised to find Nat absent. He returned, however, in a short time, and I saw at once by his nervous, flustered manner that something unusual had occurred. Biddon questioned him rather closely, as he suspected something, but Nat evaded his inquiries, and would not admit that he had seen anything to excite alarm or apprehension. "I'm going out, and when I come back I'll tell you what's the matter with them traps," said Biddon, seizing his rifle and departing. I waited until he was beyond hearing, and then turning to my companion, asked, "What is the matter with you, Nat?" "Why?" he asked in turn with a start. "Because you show plainly that something has occurred to alarm you." He remained silent a moment, and then seizing his hat, jerked it off his head, and threw it spitefully down, where he gazed at it a second, and exclaimed, "I'm sick of this." "Sick of what?" "Why, of being in this fix." "I don't understand you. Please explain what you mean." "I should think you ought to know." "But I do not." "Why, this wood is full of Injins. They're behind every tree and stump, and in every bush, and you can hardly step without pitching over some painted heathen." "I am afraid you are exaggerating," I answered, suppressing a smile which was struggling at the corners of my mouth. "No, I ain't. I swear there are 10,000 Injuns just waiting outside to pounce upon us." "You're talking nonsense, and you know it." "Well, there's one Injun, for I seen him." "Come, now," he affirmed, as if the matter was now settled beyond a question. "Ah, that alters the case considerably. I shouldn't wonder at all if there is one or half dozen savages in the forest." "If you see one savage, haven't you a right to suppose there's 100 more about, I should like to know?" "Not always, Nat. I have seen 3 myself, yet I do not believe there is another one in the neighborhood." "But I have not heard the particulars of this affair of which you have been speaking. Please let me hear them." "There isn't much to tell, but there is enough to make you do a heap of thinking. You see, after you had left, I took a notion that I must have a morning ramble, and I thought, too, there might be such a thing as you two running into danger and needing my help." "I should like to know what you're laughing at." So, on the whole, there was no hesitation upon my part. Taking my rifle out, I was soon making my way as noiselessly as possible in a direction from the river. I hadn't gone more than a dozen yards before I commenced thinking about Injuns, and came nigh going back again. I wasn't afraid at all, you know, but then it appeared to me I might bring you and Biddon into trouble. However, I kept on. I had gone some distance further, when all of a sudden I heard a terrible whir and rattle, and jumped clean off my feet. But it was only a big owl which I had stirred up. I was so provoked at the start he gave me, that I should have wrung his neck had I got my hands upon him. But I went on. Pretty soon I reached a little stream of water, and as I jumped across, what do you suppose I saw in the sand? I am sure I cannot tell. Nothing less than a big moccasin track, and what was more, it hadn't been made there a week before. I stood and looked at it a good while, cogitating some wonderful things. At last I stooped and went to measuring it. I was just going to rise when I heard a grunt right by me. I jumped up so quick, to be ready, you know, that I floundered backward into the water, and I may be shot if there wasn't a big painted Injun standing not 10 feet off. He didn't say a word, but just stood and looked at me with them awful eyes of his. As soon as I could think, I raised my gun, took a quick aim, and pulled the trigger. But the infernal gun snapped. I pulled it again, but it wouldn't go, and I just happened to think the thing wasn't loaded. All this time the painted imp stood grinning at me, without saying a word except to kind of grunt. He had a big shining gun in one hand, and I was dreadful afraid he would shoot it. I told him not to stir, but to stand still till I got mine loaded, and he waited. But somehow or other I suppose I was in such a hurry that things wouldn't go right. Instead of putting the powder in the gun barrel, I crammed it into my pocket, and jammed the ramrod into my shoe. I told the Injun to have patience, and I'd get it loaded in a minute. I got it fixed somehow at last, and hauled it up to my shoulder, when no Injun was there. I looked behind, all about me, and up into the trees, but he'd been spirited away somewhere. However, I made up my mind to shoot at the spot where he had stood, and I up and blazed away. That is, I blazed away without the gun going off. I believe he spirited that too. Let me examine it. Perhaps you made some blunder. Nope, I'm sure I didn't. I took the rifle with a smile of certainty that I should find something the matter with it. Sure enough, the muzzle was crammed with paper, and upon removing it, a pipe stem broken in pieces rolled out, while there was not a grain of powder in the barrel. "I declare I forgot about the powder," exclaimed Nat, opening his eyes in wonder. "But not about the bullet," I laughed, pointing to the fragments of his pipe. "How'd that get there?" he angrily asked. "That's the question. I didn't put it there. Who did, then?" "I don't know, I declare." Nat picked up the fragments and examined them carefully. "That's my pipe, sure, and I had it in my mouth, I remember, when I started out, and missed it coming back. I didn't put it in the gun, though." "Let it pass, then. Did you see no more of your Indian friend?" "No, he knew enough to keep out of my way. I waited a long time for him, and at last started home again. I kept an eye on every suspicious object, but, as I said, seen nothing." At this point I gave free vent to my pent-up mirth. Nat, much astonished, looked wonderingly at me, seemingly at a loss to understand the cause. "I do not see what there is to laugh at," he remarked, reprovingly. "If it's a laughing matter to know that there are Injuns all about you, why, you must laugh." "Your adventure with the Indian, Nat, and the singular load in your rifle, appears to me to be a funny matter, and I trust you will pardon me if—" "Didn't I tell you I didn't put it in there? It was the Injun's work." And to this day Nat cannot be made to believe that he was instrumental in introducing the pipe into his gun. After a few more unimportant remarks, the conversation ceased. Nat's adventure began to appear to me in a different light from that in which I had viewed it at first. I doubted not but that he was perfectly honest and truthful in what he said. But why, when exposed to the will of the savage, did he escape unscathed? Why did the latter stand fearless and harmless before him? And what meant these strange signs, these footprints, which were becoming visible around us? Matters were assuming a puzzling form. We were being environed by Indians, without any evidence of hostility upon their part. What meant it? Surely there was a meaning too deep and hidden for us to divine as yet. Suddenly Nat spoke. "Don't you remember the canoe? We were going to hunt for that today." "Oh, how did I forget that? But had we not better wait till Biddon returns?" "No, let us go at once. Hark! What's that?" I held my breath as the distant report of a rifle reached our ears. The next instant came a sound, faint and far away, yet clear and distinct. A horrid, unearthly sound, as the cry of a being in mortal agony. End of chapter 5.
Chapter 6 of Bill Biddon, Trapper. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Bill Biddon, Trapper, by Edward Sylvester Ellis. Chapter 6. Still in the Dark. The Canoe Again. For a moment we stood breathless, paralyzed and speechless. Then our eyes sought each other with a look of fearful inquiry. "Was that Biddon's voice?" I asked in a faint whisper. "I don't know. There it is again!" And again came that wild howling shriek, of such agony as made our blood curdle within us. "It is his voice! Let us hasten to his aid!" I exclaimed, catching my rifle and springing out. Nat followed closely, his gun having been reloaded. The cry came from up the river, and toward it we dashed, scrambling and tearing through the brush and undergrowth, like two maddened animals, heedless of what the consequence might be. Several times we halted and listened, but heard nothing save our own panting breasts and leaping hearts. On again we dashed, looking hurriedly about us, until I knew we had ascended as high as could be the author of that startling cry. Here we paused and listened. No one was to be seen. I turned toward Nat, standing behind me, and directly behind him I saw Biddon slowly approaching. "What are you doing here?" he asked as he came up. "Was not that your voice which I just heard?" "I rather reckon it wasn't. When you hear Bill Biddon bawl out in that way, just let me know, will you?" "What under the sun was it?" I asked then, greatly relieved. "That's more nor me can tell, but shoot and skin me if I can't tell you one thing." He approached closely and whispered, "There's something else nor reds about here." "What do you mean?" I asked, although I understood well enough what he meant. "I's here once afore, as I told you, and I never heerd such goings on then. I've seed the tracks of moccasins all about the traps, but can't draw a bead on the shadder